Okay. This morning, we're going to talk about superheroes, okay? And I have asked Evan Samuelson to come and help me, and he's going to illustrate our discussion. And while we're talking about superheroes, he is going to create a comic book cover for us. Speaking of superheroes, as they're getting it set up, let's go around and we'll survey the room. Tell me some of your favorite superheroes. Captain America. All right. Who else? Arrow. Hot Girl. Leave it to Jenny to make sure the women are represented in the super. Mighty Mouse, old school. Who else? Superman. Good and excellent. Now, when we talk about superheroes, some things are easy to figure out. Like, what makes a superhero super? Well, usually they can shoot webs out of their wrists, or they come from an alien planet and our yellow sun gives them super strength, right? Everybody's looking at Evan. Another thing is they have an identity, right? We know Batman. We know who Batman is because he's the guy with the mask, right? We know who Superman is because he's got the red cape and the blue suit. They have an identity. But one of the things I want to explore today, one of the questions is, what makes a superhero a hero? Okay? And to do that, we're going to talk about a man in the Bible. This man was born to be king. His birth was heralded and celebrated by royalty. As he grew up, he found favor with those around him. He was a true leader. He was to become a national symbol. He was a hero to thousands. He was a man of action. He was a man of faith. He even pulled off the miraculous. He resisted the status quo. He stood in stark contrast to the failed leadership of his day. His followers, they proved that they were willing to die for him. His men loved him. As you read his story in the Bible, you will find a model citizen. He didn't stumble in the areas of integrity or character. But sadly, his life was cut short. He was killed. His body hung in ridicule for all to see. But one of the most remarkable things about his story is when he came to his end, he marched willingly and knowingly to his death. This story sounds familiar, doesn't it? You guys are sitting there going, oh, I know this story. I know who we're talking about. And if you know this story, then you know that this hero, this national leader, this man born to be king, willingly set aside his right to be king. He didn't just lay it aside, he laid it aside. He laid aside being first and chose to faithfully to follow God's plan, even though he knew it meant his own death. He chose a position to be second. He chose to serve. He chose to serve. He chose to serve rather than be served. This morning, we're going to look at 3 moments in the life of Jonathan. The first moment we're going to find in 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 14. And we read there this account. A day or so later, Prince Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, hey, come on. Let's go across the valley to the garrison of the Philistines. But he didn't tell his father, King Saul, that he was leaving. Now, I probably should have prefaced this story. This is a time when the Philistines were occupying Israel. And they were kind of having their way in Israel. And the Israelites they were a brand new nation. They had come under King Saul, was their first king. And so King Saul and his 600 men were camped out at the edge of Gibeah, around the pomegranate tree at Migron. No one realized that Jonathan had gone. Now, to reach the Philistine garrison, Jonathan had to go over a narrow pass between 2 rocky cliffs, one on the north and one on the south. Jonathan said, let's go across to those heathen. Jonathan, perhaps the Lord will do a miracle for us. For it makes no difference to him how many enemy troops there are. The youth said, all right. Do what you think is best. I'm with you heart and soul, whatever you decide. All right then. Jonathan's getting excited. He says, then this is what we'll do. When they see us, if they say, stay where you are, we'll kill you, then we'll just stop there and wait for them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then that's what we're going to do. For that'll be the sign to us that God is going to help us defeat them. Now, when the Philistines saw them coming, they shouted, look, the Israelis are crawling out of their holes, and they laughed. Ha, ha, ha. Then they shouted to Jonathan, come on up here and we'll show you how to fight. Come on, Jonathan shouted to his armor bearer. The Lord will help us defeat them. So they climbed up on their hands and knees. And the Philistines fell back as Jonathan and his armor bearer killed them right and left. Suddenly a great panic broke out through the entire Philistine army. And just then God sent a great earthquake to increase the terror, to provide a little more, oh yeah. That day God used Jonathan to bring a great victory to Israel, a day that they would throw off the oppression of an enemy who occupied their nation. Now, let's look at another scene. And this scene, David has become pretty famous, and Saul is getting a little jealous. And we fast forwarded a few years, and Saul is looking to kill David. And in 1 Samuel 19:19, we can read, Saul urged his aides and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. But Jonathan, because of his close friendship with David, told him what his father was planning. Tomorrow morning, he warned him, you must find a hiding place out in the fields. I'll ask my father to go out with me, and I'll talk to him about you. And then I'll tell you everything I can find out. The next morning, as Jonathan and his father were walking together, he spoke well of David and begged his dad not to be against him. He's never done anything to harm you, Jonathan pleaded. He's always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten the time he risked his life to kill Goliath? And how the Lord brought a great victory to Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why now do you want to murder an innocent man? There's no reason for it. Finally, Saul agreed, and he vowed, as the Lord lives, David shall not be killed. Afterwards, Jonathan called David and told him what had happened, and then he took David to Saul, and everything had been as it had been before. Now, the last moment is a little tricky because we take that moment and we're going to split it in time. But the first part of that moment comes at the close of one of the most famous stories in the Bible, David and Goliath. Let's pick up the scene. David has defeated Goliath, defeated the giant, and cut off his head. And now Saul, the king, has brought David in for a debriefing because he wants to get to know this kid, this man who has just defeated the most notorious enemy of Israel. Jonathan is standing off to the side as this interview takes place. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan, he made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. This was their first encounter, their first meeting. The culmination of this moment comes some years later when Jonathan finally comes to grips with the fact that his dad, his father, the king, will stop at nothing until he has killed Jonathan's best friend, David. And Jonathan chooses that day to save David's life by giving him time to escape. So in 1 Samuel chapter 20, so Jonathan made a covenant with the family of David, and David swore to it with a terrible curse against himself and his descendants, should he be unfaithful to his promise. But that wasn't good enough for Jonathan. Jonathan made David swear by the love that David had for Jonathan. For he loved him as much as he loved himself. And then picking up in verse 41, both of them were crying as they said goodbye, especially David. At last, Jonathan said to David, Come on, cheer up, buddy. For we have entrusted each other and each other's children into God's hands forever. They parted, David going away and Jonathan returning to the city. This was probably the last time they ever met and saw each other. Folks, these moments may not seem all that remarkable. You might be thinking that, hey, maybe Jonathan didn't have what it took to be king, that he was a pushover. Read his story in 1 Samuel. He did not become a national hero because he was a pretty boy, because he was a pampered prince, because he was a pushover. Jonathan was a war hero. When the armies of Israel were sitting around wondering what to do, Jonathan's the one that attacked the enemy. He caused great victories for his country. He was no pushover. He was a man of action. He was a man of faith. He was a man who chose to serve. However, his story seems more like a side note. He's not even the main character in it. He had a supporting role. Now, before I issue God's challenge for us today, let me preface it with this. What I love about Sierra Pine South is that you all embody Jonathan's story. That you are a group of people who have laid aside their right to come to church and leave. That you have shown yourselves to be servant leaders. And it's an honor to call you family and friends. And please don't take this as a cheap ploy to sign up more volunteers, because here's the truth. God wants you involved, but not for his sake and not for my sake, but for your sake. Because God knows that when we're serving, we're thriving. And he knows that because he wired us that way. Now, some of us, I'm going to pick on these girls over here just because they're related. Some of us are sitting out here thinking, oh, can't get too close to that speaker. Some of us are out here thinking, I can't be Jonathan. I'm not a hero. I don't have what it takes. I can't do what he did. Well, you're probably right. But let's look at what Jonathan did. Let's take that last scene that we talked about, where the two friends are saying goodbye. What did Jonathan really do? He acted like a true friend. And you might be right. It might be too much for us to treat the people that come in those doors as a true friend. What about the scene before that? I get to sit down. You're saying, now, George, Jonathan stood up to the king. I don't have that kind of clout. He was the prince. He was heir to the throne. He could get away with that. But what did he really do? He talked to his dad. He stood up for somebody who was being mistreated. He challenged the status quo. He stood up for what was right. Again, that might be too much to ask, huh? Now, here's my people over here. I sit on the right side. Come on, George. These guys will challenge you big time. And they say, come on, George, that's not fair. You make it sound so simple. Oh, wait a minute, George. There's one more scene. What about the first scene, George? Yeah, what about the first scene, George? We don't have any Philistines to conquer. And I'm sure that God is not asking us to go hacking away at people that don't believe in him. You guys are right. But is that what Jonathan really did? I don't think that hacking away at the Philistines was the point of the story. I would venture to say that the point of the story is found in his words to his armor bearer. Perhaps the Lord will do a miracle for us. Perhaps the Lord will do a miracle for us. What Jonathan did was he believed God. He exercised a little faith. can we believe God? Will we believe God? Will we dare to step out in ministry to see what God can do? Let's go be Jonathans. Let's find somebody who is doing God's work and go join them. Let's support them. We don't have to lead a ministry to be great. Jonathan was great. Few in the Bible were greater. But yet he chose to serve. He chose to play second fiddle. Here's what I know. If we choose to be Jonathans, then God's going to have an army of superheroes at his command. And that brings us back to our initial question this morning. What is it that makes a superhero a hero? I believe it's that they choose to serve. The difference between a supervillain and a superhero, the supervillain is serving themselves. The superhero is serving others. Speaking of heroes, how is Evan doing? Hey, everybody, give Evan a hand. He is not done. Evan, I want to thank you. That looks awesome. Evan is my Jonathan this morning. Evan, I want to thank you so much. He hasn't heard this part as we were practicing back there, but I couldn't do this without Evan. He's Jonathan this morning. And that's what we need to do. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this is probably where I need to give Jonathan a high five and have him sit down. You can come back and finish later, okay? Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and you've heard over 1,000 words today. So let's try something different. Here's what I want you to do. I'll get out of the way, but I want us to focus on that picture. Okay, take it in. Now, I want us to close our eyes, and I want us to imagine ourselves as the hero in this picture. Hold that image. Lord, I thank you for all that you do for us. Thank you for giving us people like Jonathan who can inspire us. Thank you for people like Jonathan who give us a picture of something to aspire to. Lord, you are our leader, you are our commander, and you are our king. We admire who you are. Now, Lord, I ask that you would use today to stir our hearts to be Jonathan, that we would choose to serve, that you would open our eyes to find places where we can help, that we would redouble our efforts where we are helping with great enthusiasm. And finally, Lord, let there be an expectancy. Open our eyes to see where the Jonathans are going to pop up. Help us to watch for those aha moments when we see each other becoming superheroes. Amen. Now, if you have, as the band's coming up, if anything you've heard this morning has kind of struck a chord in your heart, here's what you do. Ben says he prays for our communication cards.